right then, welcome everybody. So today's topic is stopping unwanted behaviors through the use of proper punishment. I'm going to work you through my newest workbook, Proper Punishment, and it will be available for you to download in the comments below. So let's begin. What is proper punishment? So proper punishment is the only way to stop an unwanted behavior. So there's only one way to stop an unwanted behavior, and that's the use of punishment. There is no way to stop an unwanted behavior through positive reinforcement. So I know there are a lot of myths and misconceptions that you can stop behavior with lack of punishment or lack of negative consequence. That is, according to behavioral psychology, impossible. That cannot happen. For a dog to stop an unwanted behavior, or any behavior for that matter, there needs to be an unbearable or negative consequence to that behavior. And if there is not, then the dog will do the behavior whenever it likes. So proper punishment is just the proper application of punishment. It's a system that we use. There are obviously many methods and tools of punishment out there. This is just the one we use according to our workbook. So I'm going to share with you the first page of the workbook. If you have any discussions, you can just let me know on the workbook. So now let me start working you through it. The table of contents, the topics we will be covering is applying proper punishment, which is guidelines to proper punishment, tools for proper punishment, tips for success. Then we get behavior modification, which is reinforcing unwanted behavior, arousing over threshold, and creativity in stopping unwanted behaviors. So let's dive right into the guidelines. So there are guidelines for proper punishment. It's not as simple as just blasting punishments at your dog from left and right. There are certain guidelines that you must follow for the punishment to be safe, effective, and understandable to the dog. So the very first guideline we have here is your punishment must be unbearable to the dog. So whatever method, whatever tool you're using, whatever it may be, it must be unbearable to the dog. An example of an unbearable situation, or to rephrase that, unbearable does not mean nasty, harmful, or hurtful. It doesn't mean kicking, hitting, screaming, yelling at your dog. It just means unbearable. The punishment is unbearable. The dog cannot bear it. An example of this would be, let's say you go to bed at night with the window open, okay? And a cricket sneaks into your window or into your house through the open window and starts chirping all night long. You are obviously going to wake up, get up, and do everything in your power to remove that cricket. Even if you stay up the entire night doing it, you will find that cricket. Because I don't know about you, but a chirping cricket while I'm trying to sleep is more than unbearable. So that's an example of an unbearable consequence. Now, not only are you going to do everything in your power to remove the cricket, but you're going to do your best to make sure the cricket does not come back. So you're not going to hate crickets, but you're going to make sure the cricket does not come back. So you're going to secure your windows, maybe put a little bit of meshing or netting on. You're going to do everything in your power to make sure that never happens again. So that's a human example of an unbearable consequence. So that is why we listed it as the very first rule, or the very first guideline, is your punishment must be unbearable. So what are examples of punishments that are bearable? A scolding for most dogs is bearable. So I know a lot of owners scold their dogs. Most of the time that's bearable, unless you're really screaming and yelling at the dog. most of the time that's bearable. So the next guideline is your punishment must be recognizable. So what that means is your dog must understand why it is being punished. You can't just come home from work one day and see your couch has been completely destroyed, right? And then grab the dog and shove his nose in the couch and start punishing the dog. It doesn't work that way. Your dog needs to know why it is being punished. And that's why the most effective way to do this is we use the marker no. So the word no marks the behavior that we are trying to punish. For example, the dog that chewed up the couch, if you wanted to effectively punish the dog, you would have had to say no the moment the dog started chewing the couch. So for behaviors that we're trying to stop, we mark it with no. We wait 1 to 3 seconds, and then we apply a punishment. All right. Now, is the 1 to 3 seconds a general rule? No, it is not. You can wait 10 seconds. You can wait 20 seconds. You can wait 30 minutes with your punishment if you have conditioned the dog properly and the dog understands the word no. But for starters, it's recommended that you wait 1 to 3 seconds after you've marked before you apply the punishment. So, for example, dog jumps on me. I mark with no. I wait 1 to 3 seconds, and then I bonk the dog on the head, which is a punishment. So for now, I want you to wait 1 to 3 seconds. Later on, you can extend it longer and longer and longer. And if you really want to put effort into it, you can extend it up to 30 minutes. Now, the next guideline is your punishment must be unavoidable. So the dog must not be able to avoid your punishment. For example, let's say you see your dog chewing up the couch. You say no. You throw the bonker at your dog and you miss, while the dog just avoided an unbearable consequence. So you missed, the dog escaped it and avoided it, walked away, and therefore there was no unbearable consequence. So if you throw your bonker or apply your punishment and you miss, you do not get the dog, then you have to reapply the punishment. So if for example, with the couch scenario, you say no when the dog chews the couch, you throw the bonker, you miss, you have to pick it up again and throw the dog again. If the dog is running away from you, it's best to get the dog under leash control first before you apply punishment. Because the worst thing you can do is run around after your dog, throwing your dog with bonkers almost a dozen times before you actually hit the dog. That's the worst, one of the worst things you can do. You want to try and avoid that as much as possible. All right, so your punishment, remember, it must be unavoidable. The dog must not be able to avoid your punishment. The next guideline is your punishment must be predictable. So there must always be a predictable outcome to an unwanted behavior. For example, when dog jumps, there's going to be a bonker flying at the dog's face every time. So that the dog can learn, oh, if I jump, boom, towel flies at my face. I can predict that. So a human example of this would be, how long did it take you to learn that touching a hot stove is going to burn you quite a bit? So maybe the first time you touched it, it burned you. You didn't exactly believe it was going to happen again. Then you touched it again, maybe a few weeks later. It burned you again, but you were still not quite convinced that you were being burned because the stove was hot and red. And then you tried it a third time, and then you realized that, you know what, touching a red hot stove plate has the exact same predictable outcome. I'm going to get burned every time I touch it. So that's how you stop the unwanted behavior, is you make sure that your punishment is predictable. Whenever your dog jumps, there is the same predictable consequence, which is a punishment. Now, every now and then, you might not have a tool for punishment available. You might not have your bonker, and you have to stop the unwanted behavior. In that case, it's fine to say no and not follow through with a punishment, but you want to avoid it as much as possible. So remember, every time there's not a predictable consequence, it makes it a little bit more difficult to stop. So if you have to, it's acceptable not to follow through with a punishment or with a predictable outcome, but you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So you want to be as consistent with your punishment. Now, the fifth guideline is you want to remain neutral. So when you're punishing your dog, you're not screaming, you're not yelling, you're not mad, you're not frustrated, you're calm, you're collective, and punishment is not this thing of, oh, now I'm going to punish you. It's just matter of fact. You jumped on me, punishment, matter of fact. I'm not angry, I'm not frustrated, I'm calm. So you want to be nice and neutral in your punishment, and that's why we use specialized tools, is so that we can remain as neutral as possible. The final guideline is your punishment must be overwhelming to the dog. It must overwhelm your dog's behavior. Meaning, if you apply a punishment, it must stop the dog dead in its tracks, or stop the behavior dead in its tracks. A lot of people are claiming that they're punishing their dog, they're throwing the dog with the bonker, and the dog just doesn't care. The dog's picking it up and playing tug with the bonker. The reason is because you're not overwhelming your dog with the punishment. Either you're throwing it too soft, or your dog is too excited. So an example of a dog that is overly excited or aroused up to a point where punishment doesn't work would be some dogs. There was once a case, or some dogs are so high drive that they can be chasing after a cat or a squirrel, and you can have a shock collar, an e-collar on them, and you can blast them on the highest level for 10 seconds, and they wouldn't stop the behavior. So they'll be running towards a squirrel with you sitting there on the highest level on the e-collar blasting the dog. The dog's going to scream, the dog's going to chunk, but it's not going to stop the unwanted behavior. The dog's not going to stop chasing the squirrel. Why? Because your dog is so overly aroused, your dog is over threshold, that your punishment means nothing to the dog. So if you find that your punishment is not overwhelming your dog, it's not stopping the behavior dead in its tracks, what you want to do is you want to go back. Then it's a question of timing. So we can deduce that punishing your dog for the act of chasing the squirrel does not work because the dog is too over threshold. So what happens if you punish the dog when the dog walks towards the squirrel? You will probably have a 50-50 chance of overwhelming that behavior, but I want you to go even further back and look at the trigger. When does this all happen? This all happens, the behavior happens, it starts when the dog looks at the squirrel. So when the dog looks at the squirrel, that's when you apply your punishment. And then you will have a 100% guarantee that you will overwhelm the dog's behavior, and you can properly punish that behavior. So remember, the sixth and final guideline is your punishment must overwhelm your dog. Watch for arousal. If your dog is too excited, your punishment most likely would not work. In that event, go back and punish even sooner find the trigger when the behavior starts. In this case, it would be the moment the dog looks at the squirrel. So now let's talk about tools for proper punishment. So one of our favorite tools for proper punishment, but it's not the only tool we use. We actually use dozens of very interesting tools to stop unwanted behaviors. But the most popular one, and the one we use the most, is the bonker, the rolled up towel. So this is basically just a rolled up towel secured by 2 rubber bands. There's no metal pole or anything hard inside the towel or on the outside. It's just a cotton rolled up towel. It's not going to hurt your dog. It's not going to send your dog to the vet. It's honestly just a towel. So how do you use the bonker? While you throw or hit your dog on the head area, never directly from the front on the nose, the eyes, and you don't throw the dog on the body, the back, the legs, the stomach. You always aim for the head. So what you want to do is, you don't want to use the same size bonker on a Yorkie, what do they call, miniature sized dog, as you would on a Great Dane, which is a giant breed dog. So this is a good balance. This is a good size bonker, but I would use a smaller one for a miniature dog. The next thing is you want to watch for not to throw the dog directly from the front, like I said, here by the nose. And you want to watch not to throw the dog on the eyes, especially with dogs that have bulging eyes. So throw the dog on top of the head, on the sides of the head, wherever, except the rest of the body. You can still get away with the neck, but I want you to throw and aim at the head area. Now, like I was telling you, a bonker, throwing your dog with a bonker is an unbearable thing for most dogs. It's not going to traumatize your dog. It's not going to hurt your dog. It's not going to ruin your relationship. That is all nonsense. We're not finding that to be true. Okay? So try it according to these guidelines, and you will most likely find the same results. Your dog's fine. The next tool which we popularly use for proper punishment is a leash correction. So a leash correction is a quick pop, flick of the wrist on a leash, which propels the dog in a certain direction. Now, how would we use that is if the dog is bolting out the door, we would give the dog a leash pop back. And that would actually punish the dog from bolting out the door, and the dog would stay. So once again, you need a little bit of guidance and common sense when using a leash pop. Is don't use the same amount of force on a miniature breed dog in your leash pop as you would on a Great Dane. If you have a Great Dane that's running out your door and you're attached to the leash, you are most likely going to have to hold on to something. And you're going to have to use your entire body strength to get the dog not to run out the door. But for a miniature dog, you can sit there or you can stand there with a cup of coffee in your hand and do this protocol without even spilling your coffee. So what are other tools of punishment? Well, there are thousands of tools that you can use for punishment. Not just commercial things or household things like bonkers, but even simple things that you wouldn't even know about, like a door. So you can absolutely use your front door as a tool for punishment. How can you do that? Well, let's say you have a dog that is constantly bolting through the door. Let's say you open up the door, the front door in the mornings to go outside, and here your dog is from outside, bolting right through into the house, right between your legs, and that's obviously a dangerous behavior. How can you stop that behavior? Close the door. So dog bolts, you close the door. Then the dog hits the door with its nose. and that is an unbearable punishment. There you've just used a door, a simple door, to punish your dog. So there are lots of tools you can use to punish your dog. It's not just about leash corrections, bonkers, and doors. You can really get creative of what you can use to create an unbearable consequence or proper punishment. Just make sure that you're not harming the dog. So now let's talk about tips for success. So the very first thing when you're trying to stop unwanted behaviors is you want to be proactive in your punishment. So don't wait until your dog magically jumps on you out of nowhere, or until your dog magically steals food off the counter out of nowhere. Set up training drills. So set up simulations where you know your dog is going to do the unwanted behavior so that you can mark and punish the behavior. So set up those drills, be proactive. You're going to wait a long time if you just wait for the behavior to magically appear. And if you do that, you might not be ready for it. Then the next thing is repeating markers. Don't repeat your markers all the time. A lot of people, when they're trying to stop, for example, jumping, dog jumps, they say, no, no, no. And after the third no, then they give the punishment. So repeating the marker or the word no, remember, the word no marks the behavior. You are harming its value. So we're trying to teach the dog that when you hear the word no, oh, that's the behavior that I'm being punished for. That's what we're teaching the dog. So that's why I say no once. If the dog doesn't react, you still go on with the punishment. And even if the dog does react, you still punish the dog to keep that consistency, that predictable outcome. So if your dog jumps and you said no and the dog jumps off you, still punishment. The next one is taking your time. So when you're punishing your dog, take your time. A lot of people are rushing to punish their dogs. They're in such a hurry to say no and throw the dog with the bonker that they're making mistakes. They're not remaining neutral. They're getting frustrated. They're missing. They're not marking at the right time, etc. As long as you mark the behavior, meaning as long as when the dog jumps on you, you say no, you can wait, for starters, 3 seconds before you have to apply punishment. And later on, you can wait 10, 20, 30, 40 seconds, or even 30 minutes. So there's no reason for you to rush. Rather take it slowly, old grandma style. Walk towards the dog. Don't run. So rather do it slowly and do it properly than rush and make those mistakes. So it's one of the biggest mistakes we're seeing owners make when executing proper punishment is that they're trying to do it so fast because they believe the dog's going to forget everything or the dog's going to run away from them. It doesn't matter if your dog runs away. You just go ahead and you go and fetch it and you continue on with the punishment. Then lack of no means yes. So remember, whenever you're not saying no to a behavior that you're trying to stop, you're saying yes. So an example would be, let's say you're trying to stop your dog from jumping on guests. So far, you've punished your dog for jumping on guests, on every guest so far. But there's this one guest that comes every now and then, even if it's just once a month, a very judgmental guest that scolds you whenever they see you punish the dog. And you decide, you know what, just this once, I'm just going to leave my dog be. So you're basically saying, hey, bud, you're allowed to jump on people. But then when your dog does it on someone else, you're saying no. So you're confusing the dog and you're making it more difficult to stop the behavior. So remember, lack of no means yes. So the next thing is, remember, consistency is very important. So you will most likely have to punish a behavior more than once. You'll have to punish jumping more than once. So be consistent. Always make sure there's the same predictable outcome for an unwanted behavior, and don't give up. So don't give up after the third attempt and your dog's still jumping. Go back to the guidelines and see, maybe are you making a mistake? If you're not, keep at it. So your dog will be testing you. Where is your boundaries? Where is your limitations? Are you going to give up? If you give up, you've just proved your dog right. So then your dog wins, and the behavior will never be stopped. So now let's talk about behavior modification, reinforcing unwanted behaviors. So there are many instances where we are directly and indirectly reinforcing unwanted behaviors, meaning you're encouraging your dog actually to jump on you while you're trying to stop your dog from jumping. So the most common way we are reinforcing our dogs for unwanted behaviors is indirectly. So let's say you're trying to stop your dog from excessively whining when you leave the house because your dog misses you and he's sad that you're leaving and you have to go to work and you only come back at 5, and you want to stop that behavior. You put on your bar collar and you're starting to punish the act of whining, but just before you leave, you're like, oh, goodbye, 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 a little bit of belly rub, talking in a excited tone, basically telling your dog goodbye. And the dog's getting all excited. And then when you get back home from work, you greet your dog and you hug your dog and you're like, good boy, good boy, good boy. So you're trying to stop the act of whining, but you're not succeeding. Why? Because you're reinforcing the whining by greeting your dog and saying goodbye to your dog when you leave home from work and when you arrive. I know it sounds harsh, but I mean, that's an absolute fact. You're reinforcing the whining by giving your dog attention when you leave or arrive at the home. So you will have great difficulty stopping the whining if you're reinforcing it by petting your dog and giving your dog attention. So then what you would do is you would simply stop reinforcing. So stop reinforcing the behavior. When you leave for work, you leave for work. You don't say goodbye to your dog. When you arrive from work, you don't say hi to your dog. Sure, you can say hello 3 minutes later, but just that meeting point where the dog is excited and aroused, you just ignore your dog. Another example of, or a less common way of reinforcing behavior is directly. So let's say you're trying to stop jumping, but every time your guests come over, you let your dog jump on them. So like I said, maybe you're just embarrassed to punish your dog in front of your guests because they might be judgmental. But then you're trying to get your dog to stop jumping on you and your family. So by letting your dog jump, you're reinforcing the behavior directly. The other way of reinforcing a behavior is arousing your dog. So the other way we are reinforcing unwanted behaviors is through arousal. So oftentimes we are reinforcing unwanted behaviors simply by exciting our dogs when we should remain calm. An example of this would be you're trying to stop jumping, but every time you see your dog, you're like, oh, hello, good boy, good boy, good boy. And you're petting your dog and you're getting your dog all excited. And then your dog jumps on you. And then you punish it. And then you're like, good boy, good boy. Once again, you're exciting the dog. And then the dog jumps on you again. So by arousing your dog like that, you are reinforcing the unwanted behavior. So for starters, your dog may not be ready for that kind of excitement. So that kind of excitement only reinforces the behavior you're trying to stop. So for now, not forever, you want to remain calm and you want to dial it down back. So you just want to remain nice and calm until your dog is ready and you can actually give it pets without it jumping on you. So remember, especially with arousing your dog, remain calm or it's going to be very difficult to stop the behavior. Let's see what's next. Yes. So let's talk about arousal. One of the greatest problems when stopping unwanted behaviors, especially reactivity, is your dog's level of arousal. We call it arousing over threshold. Now, what is a threshold? A threshold is a point at which your dog goes. And in the case of punishment, if your dog goes over this point, you can't punish the behavior. But if your dog is under this point, you can punish the behavior. So the hardest part of stopping excited or reactivity is your dog's constantly up here. So consider the dog that was chasing the squirrel. Once again, the owner was blasting it on the highest level in the shock collar. It had no effect. Why? Because the dog was over this threshold. So you need to go back and punish the dog when the dog is under the threshold. So the dog is over the threshold when it's chasing the squirrel. It's at the threshold when it's walking towards the squirrel, preparing to run. And it's under the threshold when it looks at the squirrel. So that's when the timing comes in. You want to punish the moment the dog looks at the squirrel. So the act of looking at the squirrel is the trigger, and you want to punish that. You will find it incredibly simple to stop unruly behavior just by finding that trigger point. So a human example of this would be, let's say you see $10 on the street, right? The dirty, filthy floor. Most people will bend down to pick up $10 from the floor. I would. And if you bend down to pick up $10 from the floor, just imagine that I'm standing there and I slap you behind the head and I tell you, hey, listen, bud, that floor is dirty. You will most likely leave the $10 because for you, your dignity is probably more important than $10. But now let's say if it was $1,000, right? If you saw $1,000 on the floor and I slapped you behind and you bent down to pick it up and I slapped you behind the head and told you, listen, bud, the floor is dirty, you're probably going to tell me to F off because $1,000 is $1,000. Who cares about dignity and what other people will think about you? $1,000 is $1,000. And I know some of you are saying now, $1,000 is not enough. Okay. What if it was $1 million? So would you do it for $1 million? Your answer would be absolutely. So that's how arousal works, is $10, 1,000, million. All right, what's next? Okay, so let's talk about the creativity in stopping unwanted behaviors. Most behaviors are pretty simple and straightforward to stop, most unwanted behaviors. For example, jumping. Dog jumps, bonk the dog. More or less, it takes a little bit of effort, the dog stops the behavior. But there are some behaviors that are a little bit more complicated and require a lot more creative thinking. So let's take digging, for example. As you know now, that to stop an unwanted behavior, there has to be a predictable outcome or a punishment for the act of the behavior. So in the case of digging, if you're trying to stop your dog from digging in the yard, there has to be a punishment every time your dog digs in the yard. But now the problem is your dog is most likely digging in the yard when you're not there to supervise it, when you're not looking, when you're at work, when you are in home watching TV. So your dog is doing the behavior when you're not there to punish it. That poses a problem. Now, how are you going to punish the behavior? Well, this is where certain tools come in handy, specialized tools and a little bit of creative thinking. So let's take probably the easiest and fastest way to stop this behavior is you get yourself a crate and you get yourself an e-collar, right? So now you'll be using the crate. You will be putting your dog in the crate when you're not there to supervise your dog, basically eliminating your dog's ability to dig when you're not there to punish it. So now the dog can't dig when you're not supervising, and now you can punish the dog for digging every single time, right? And now you've got your e-collar, which means now you can remain neutral. Now you can go hide in your house or set up a video surveillance setup, and you can wait for your dog to dig. And then obviously when your dog digs, stem, punishment, same predictable outcome. Whenever your dog digs, punishment. Keep that up for a week, and you would have stopped digging most of the time. Sometimes keep it up for 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes 2 days. But the point is, now you've just made a very difficult behavior to punish. You've made it easy to punish because now you're incorporating tools and creativity that gives you the opportunity to punish the behavior. The crate and the e-collar. Could you do it without these tools? Yes, you can obviously do it, but it's not going to be as easy and as efficient, but you could absolutely do it. I mean, I do it quite often without these tools. In fact, that's how I mostly do it, because a lot of people don't have these kinds of tools. So remember, if you're trying to stop an unwanted behavior, stop for a moment and think, how can I punish this behavior following the 6 guidelines of proper punishment? So right there, that was a general work through of my book, Proper Punishment. So if you want the workbook, you can just download it in the comments below. Just follow that link and just download it. If you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me on my weekly Q&As, email me, etc. If you need more questions about proper punishment. And I really hope that you enjoyed this webinar. And please check us out. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to check out some of our videos, some of the work we do, and get to know more about us. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again soon.